Well, welcome and thank you for joining us in this old pew. We're just sort of hanging out back here and being in the back part of the church. This is where we sit around and just sort of be curmudgeon-y. And I thank you today. Today, as we prepare and look forward to Holy Week, I want to share with you a reading from the book Bread and Wine, Readings for Lent and Easter. And it's a passage from the German Protestant theologian Jürgen Moltmann. It's entitled Prisoner of Hope. The opening passage is a comment by George MacDonald. In the sickness of his agony, the will of Jesus arises perfect at last, and of itself, unsupported now, declares a naked consciousness of misery hung in the waste darkness of the universe. Declares for God in defiance of pain, of death, of apathy, of self, of negation, of the blackness within and around it. Calls aloud upon the vanished God. And Jürgen Moltmann goes on. The night before the Romans arrested him, Jesus went into the Garden of Gethsemane, taking only 3 of his friends with him, and, quote, began to be greatly distressed and troubled, as Mark writes. He began to be sorrowful and afraid, Matthew reports. In fact, he despaired. My soul is very sorrowful, even to death, he said, and begged his friends to stay awake with him. Earlier, too, Christ had often withdrawn at night in order to be united in prayer with the God whom he always called so intimately my Father. Here, for the first time, he does not want to be alone with God. He seeks protection among his friends. Protection from whom? And then comes the prayer that sounds like a demand. Father, all things are possible to thee. Remove this cup from me. Mark 14, verse 36. Spare me this suffering. What suffering? In Matthew and Luke, the prayer sounds somewhat more modest. If it is possible, and if thou art willing, remove this cup from me. Christ's request was not granted. God, his Father, rejected it. Elsewhere, we are always told, I and the Father are one. But here, Christ's communion with God seems to break down. Christ's true passion begins with the prayer in Gethsemane, which was not heard, which was rejected through the divine silence, for his true passion was his suffering from God. Of course, there was also the simple human fear of pain. But I believe that it was quite a different fear which laid hold of Christ here and lacerated his soul. It was the fear that he, the only begotten Son, who loved the Father as no one had ever loved before, could be forsaken, rejected, even cursed by that Father. He is not afraid for his life. He is afraid for God. He is afraid for the Father's kingdom, whose joy he had proclaimed to the poor. This suffering from God himself is the real torment in Christ's passion. This God-forsakenness is the cup which he is not spared. God's terrible silence in response to Christ's prayer in Gethsemane is more than a deathly stillness. It is echoed in the dark night of the soul, in which everything that makes life something living withers away, and in which hope vanishes. Martin Buber called it the eclipse of God. Who can stay awake in this night of God? Who will not be as if paralyzed by it? Jesus' friends were protected from its terrors by a profound sleep. Luke, the doctor, and other witnesses speak of a bloody sweat which fell on the ground from the wakeful, imploring Christ. The Luther Bible heads this chapter, "The Struggle in Gethsemane." The struggle with whom? Christ's struggle with himself? His struggle with death? I think it is more than that. It is Christ's struggle with God. This was his real agony. He overcame it through his self-surrender. That was his victory and our hope. At the end of Christ's passion on Golgotha, the place of execution, we hear a despairing cry to God. And at the 9th hour, Jesus cried with a loud voice, "Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani," which means, my God, why hast thou forsaken me?" For 3 hours he hung nailed to the cross, apparently in silence, locked in agony and waiting for death. And then he died with this cry, which expresses the most profound abandonment by the God on whom he had pinned all his hopes and for whom he was hanging on the cross. We shall never be able to get used to the fact that at the very center of the Christian faith, we hear this cry of the God-forsaken Christ for God. We shall always attempt to weaken its effect and to replace it by more pious parting words. What Christ was afraid of, what he wrestled with in Gethsemane, what he implored the Father to save him from, was not spared him. It happened on the cross. The Father forsook the Son, and God is silent. The Son was forsaken by the Father, rejected and cursed. He bore the judgment in which everyone is alone and in which no one can stand. Is there any answer to the question why God forsook him? Is there any answer to the agonizing questioning of disappointment and death? My God, why? Why? A real answer to this question cannot be a theoretical answer beginning with the word because. It has to be a practical answer. An experience of this kind can only be answered by another experience, not by an explanation. A reality like this can be answered only by another reality. It is the answer of resurrection. For a brief moment I forsook you, but with great compassion I will gather you. At the center of the Christian faith is the history of Christ's passion. At the center of this passion is the experience of God endured by the God-forsaken, God-cursed Christ. Is this the end of all human and religious hope? Or is it the beginning of the true hope, which has been born again and can no longer be shaken? For me, it is the beginning of true hope, because it is the beginning of a life which has death behind it and for which hell is no longer to be feared. At the point where men and women lose hope, where they become powerless and can do nothing more, the lonely, assailed, and forsaken Christ waits for them and gives them a share in his passion. The passionately loving Christ, the persecuted Christ, the lonely Christ, the Christ despairing over God's silence, the Christ who in dying was so totally forsaken for us and for our sakes, is like the brother or the friend to whom one can confide everything because he knows everything and has suffered everything that can happen to us and more. In our hopes about life, in our activity, in our love of living, we participate in his passion for the kingdom of freedom. Our disappointments, our loneliness, and our defeats do not separate us from him. They draw us more deeply into communion with him, and with the final unanswered cry, "Why, my God, why?" we join in his death cry and await with him the resurrection. This is what faith really is, believing not with the head or the lips or out of habit, but believing with one's whole life. It means seeking community with the human Christ in every situation in life, and in every situation experiencing his own history. Good Friday is the most comprehensive and most profound expression of Christ's fellowship with every human being. In him, the despair that oppresses us becomes free to hope. The arrogance with which we hinder ourselves and other people melts away, and we become as open and as vulnerable as he was. What initially seemed so meaningless and so irreconcilable, our hope and Christ's cross, belong together as a single whole, just as do the passionate hope for life and the readiness for disappointment, pain, and death. Beneath the cross of Christ, hope is born again out of the depths. The person who has once sensed this is never afraid of any depths again. His hope has become firm and unconquerable. Lord, I am a prisoner of hope. Thus ends our reading today. What a wonderful, wonderful way to look at those troubling passages. I hope you get a chance to think about that a little bit. I hope maybe it's helpful as we go forward into Holy Week. Thank you for joining us. I hope to see you next week. And go in peace.